On the 1st of September 1983, in the freezing darkness high above far eastern Russia, a Soviet fighter pilot changed the course of history with the press of a switch and a curt transmission to his commander. The target is destroyed. His was the closing shot in a mid-air drama that would confound the world and bring two superpowers closer to the brink of war, a shot that should never have been fired, because the target wasn't a hostile attacker, but a South Korean airliner, a Boeing 747 flying wildly off course into the hornet's nest, her crew oblivious to the danger. The shoot-down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 took the lives of 269 people and raised troubling questions on both sides of the Pacific. How could a trained flight crew make such a colossal navigational error and then fail to notice for 5.5 hours? Were they really so unaware? And how could Soviet air defense fail to recognize that the airliner wasn't a threat? Did they know that they were attacking a plane full of civilians? For 10 years, these questions had no concrete answers, becoming fuel for wild speculation and deliberate manipulation by politicians and amateur observers alike, building a cloud of myth and mystery around the events of that September night. But with the end of the Cold War came an end to the embargo on information. And since 1993, a great deal has come to light about what really happened, not only on board Flight 007, but also among the Soviet military personnel who shot it down, and within the halls of power in Moscow and Washington, where staunch Cold Warriors used the shoot-down to further their goals at the expense of the truth. Piecing together the evidence reveals that that truth is at once extraordinary and mundane, unbelievable yet inevitable, monstrous, but also terrifyingly human, a story that still lingers darkly in the imagination, more than 40 years after it began. The city of Anchorage, Alaska, has long been a key port of call for flights between East Asia and the US and Europe, serving as a vast refueling station and cargo hub where many planes land but relatively few passengers disembark. Today, passenger flights generally skip the Anchorage pit stop. The advent of ultra-long-haul jets and the end of strict airspace bans in China and Russia now allow most East Asian airlines to reach their destinations directly. During the 1980s, however, tense geopolitical relations prevented European, American, Korean, Japanese, or Taiwanese airlines from entering the airspace of the Soviet Union, forcing these companies to fly sometimes circuitous routes. For South Korean flag carrier Korean Airlines, the company's routine Flight 007 from New York to Seoul would have been most expeditiously accomplished by crossing the Canadian Arctic, skirting near the North Pole, and descending across Siberia. But because South Korea was a close ally and strategic partner of the United States, in the 1980s, Korean Airlines was forbidden from using Soviet airspace, forcing the airline to send its Boeing 747-200s on a longer, more southerly route across Alaska and the North Pacific. And that meant a stopover in Anchorage, not only to take on more fuel, but also to change crews. On a direct flight from New York to Seoul, a relief crew would be provided in order to comply with duty time limits, but the stopover allowed the airline to avoid this. The Anchorage to Seoul leg by itself only barely complied with those limits, stretching for just over 8 hours depending on wind conditions, and it was always scheduled to take place in the middle of the night, making it rather unpopular with flight crews. In fact, the crew of the ill-fated flight would later be captured discussing whether greater seniority allowed company pilots to avoid the wearying Trans-Pacific service. Scheduled to operate the Anchorage to Seoul leg of Korean Airlines Flight 007 the night of August 31st, 1983, were 3 pilots, including a rather senior captain, 45-year-old Chun Byung-in. A former Air Force pilot, Chun had previously been selected as a backup crew member for the South Korean presidential aircraft, and he had accumulated over 10,600 flying hours, over half of them on the Boeing 747. He was joined that night by 47-year-old First Officer Dong-hui, who had over 8,900 hours, and 31-year-old flight engineer Eui-dong, who had about 4,000. None had any notable prior incidents or known training difficulties. All 3 pilots were finishing a 5-day trip that took them across numerous time zones and the international date line, disturbing their bodily rhythms to a significant degree. After leaving Seoul on the first day of the trip, the crew spent 22 hours in Anchorage before operating a flight to New York, where they remained for a further 31 hours. On August 30th, the crew left New York at the helm of a cargo flight back to Anchorage with a stop in Toronto, arriving at 22:37 UTC, 13:37 Alaska time. With Flight 007 to Seoul scheduled to depart Anchorage at around 13 ZAR UTC, 4 hours in the morning Alaska time, and with considerable pre-flight activities on the schedule, they would have only 11 hours and 45 minutes of rest in the KAL crew hostel before they were expected to report for duty 80 minutes prior to the scheduled departure time, followed by a further 8 hours in the air. With the flight scheduled to arrive in Seoul at 6 a.m. Korean time on September the 1st, virtually the entire journey would take place under conditions of darkness as the airplane fled westward, away from the coming dawn. Although this schedule complied with duty time limits and was to a certain extent inevitable in the world of long-haul airline operations, it doesn't take an aeromedical expert to recognize that this crew was probably fatigued before Flight 007 even departed, and only became more so as the flight progressed. As the crew prepared for the flight, they examined a number of key documents, including weather, load information, and the airline's computer-generated flight plan. According to the manifest, there would be 269 people aboard the double-decker 747, including the 3 pilots, 20 flight attendants, and 246 passengers, 2 of whom were Korean sky marshals operating undercover to prevent hijackings. All of the passengers had boarded in New York. In total, the occupants included men, women, and children from 16 countries, including 105 from Korea, 63 from the United States, 28 from Japan, and 23 from Taiwan. One of these passengers was sitting U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald, a Democrat representing Georgia's 7th Congressional District, and the chairman of the anti-communist John Birch Society, a conservative advocacy group. Widely considered the most conservative member of the House of Representatives at the time, he harbored strong anti-Soviet views, which he planned to express at a 30th anniversary celebration of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty in Seoul. He had originally been scheduled to fly to the event with Senator Jesse Helms, Senator Steve Sims, and Congressman Carol Hubbard, but he missed the group's original flight and boarded KAL 007 instead. There is no evidence suggesting that the flight crew was aware of McDonald's presence on board. Instead, they were more likely concerned with the flight plan, which was largely familiar but contained a couple of minor deviations from the norm. Having flown between Seoul and Anchorage more than 80 times during his long career at the airline, Captain Chun was well aware of the specifics. After takeoff, they would follow Standard Instrument Departure Number 8 to the westbound J501 airway, crossing over the Cairn Mountain Non-Directional Beacon, NDB, followed by the Bethel VOR radio beacon near the west coast of Alaska. After that, they would enter oceanic airspace, where there was no radar coverage and only limited VHF radio coverage, forcing them to adhere to a unique set of oceanic navigation and communication procedures. The air corridor between Alaska and East Asia was by 1983 the second busiest oceanic air route in the world, after the North Atlantic route system between the U.S. and Europe. In order to ensure separation between aircraft flying over the ocean far from any radar stations, the region operated under a set of rules called the North Pacific Composite Route System, or NOPAC for short. Established in 1982, the NOPAC system consisted of 5 parallel routes defined by specified geographic coordinates, each with a width of 50 nautical miles, in order to accommodate potentially imprecise navigation techniques. For westbound traffic, 2 routes were available, known as R20 and R80. Korean Airlines Flight 007 was scheduled to use Route R-20, which skirted the edge of Soviet airspace near Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands in far eastern Russia, earning it the nickname Red Route 20 among some American pilots. Air traffic controllers tracked the progress of aircraft along the no-pack air routes by checking with flight crews at certain compulsory reporting points. After passing Bethel, crews were expected to check in at waypoints Nabi, Neva, Nipi, Naka, Noho, and Nanas, with a handover from Anchorage Oceanic Control to Tokyo Oceanic Control occurring at waypoint Nipi. Because there were no ground-based navigational aids within range over most of this route, following it would historically have required use of a technique called dead reckoning. Dead reckoning refers to the manual calculation of one's position by closely tracking speed, wind, heading, and elapsed time. In the early days of transoceanic flight, navigators were employed for this purpose, but by 1983 they had been superseded by a magical box called the Inertial Navigation System, or INS. Inertial navigation is essentially an advanced, automated form of dead reckoning, in which a computer uses data from a set of gyroscopes to continuously calculate the position of the airplane in three-dimensional space, much as the navigators of yore did with pen and paper. All the flight crew needed to do was enter the coordinates of the airplane's parking spot prior to pushback, wait for the system to initialize, then copy over the coordinates of the reporting points, such as Nabi and Nipi, from the oceanic air route indicated in their flight plan. Then, once airborne, the crew could link the INS to the autopilot, and the autopilot would fly the entire program track from start to finish, with any number of heading changes on the way, with no reference whatsoever to anything outside the airplane. Today, this would be done using GPS, which is much more accurate, but in 1983, INSE systems were state-of-the-art, with a drift rate of about 1 nautical mile per hour on average. This meant that after 8 hours navigating by INS, flight crews could still expect to be within 8 nautical miles laterally of the desired track, which was well within the 25 nautical mile tolerance either side of a standard oceanic airway. Furthermore, airplanes were normally equipped with 3 independent inertial navigation systems that were required to agree with one another, making a failure extremely unlikely. According to expert testimony presented to the U.S. Congress after the accident, the largest INS track error ever recorded in the no-pack route system to date was 17 nautical miles. On the ground in Anchorage, the crew of Flight 007 initialized the INS, then programmed the INS track according to the flight plan. They presumably briefed the departure and discussed the NOTAMs, notices to airmen, applicable to their route, but no direct record of this remains. Subsequently, at 12:58, Flight 007 was cleared for takeoff on runway 32 and became airborne precisely on time at 13 nam UTC, 4 SARS local. Following the standard instrument departure procedure, they climbed initially to the northwest. 40 seconds after takeoff, the Anchorage departure controller called Flight 007 and said, "Korean Air 007, Anchorage departure, radar contact, climb and maintain flight level 310, turn left, heading 220. Roger, 220. Climb and maintain 310. Roger." First Officer Sun read back. Captain Chun initiated the left turn to the southwesterly heading of 220. The purpose of this heading was to bring the plane back toward the center line of the J501 airway connecting Anchorage and Bethel, the oceanic gate for Route R20. The J501 airway was defined by 2 VOR radio beacons located in Anchorage and Bethel respectively. A VOR beacon emits VHF radio signals with distinct characteristics that allow receivers on aircraft to determine the magnetic bearing from the VOR to the airplane. This bearing is known as a radial. Historically, airways were defined according to specified radials of specified VORs, allowing flight crews to follow the airway by maintaining a particular VOR radial. When flying westbound, The J501 airway was defined by the 245-degree radial of the Anchorage VOR, which pointed directly toward the Bethel VOR, or by the reciprocal radial from Bethel if flying eastbound. With this in mind, the computerized flight plan for Flight 007 included the coordinates of the Anchorage VOR and the Bethel VOR as the first and third waypoints on the INS track. This fact was particularly important because the INS could only be engaged if the airplane was within 7.5 nautical miles of the programmed track. On the 747, a pilot desiring to follow a programmed INS track first needed to engage the autopilot, then select INS mode in the autopilot's lateral navigational channel. This would cause the autopilot to fly the airplane according to commands from the INS. But if INS mode was selected while more than 7.5 nautical miles from the programmed track, then the INS mode would arm but would not engage until the distance from the track became less than 7.5 nfm. The INS, while turned on, was aware of the airplane's location relative to the programmed track as long as the initial coordinates were accurately entered by the flight crew prior to pushback from the gate. All movements after that were tracked using the INS's dedicated gyroscopes. However, again, turning on the INS and engaging the INS mode are two different things. The INS can be fully operational, tracking the airplane's position perfectly, but this will have no bearing on where the airplane flies next unless the INS autopilot mode is engaged. In order to maneuver the airplane into the 7.5 nm INS mode engagement zone, the flight crew also needs to know their location relative to the programmed track. In this case, since the programmed track corresponded to the J501 airway, the easiest way to navigate to the track was to find the airway using the specified VOR radial, in this case, the 245-degree radial of the Anchorage VOR. However, when the pilots of Flight 007 examined their pre-flight paperwork, they presumably observed that a NOTAM had been issued, informing flight crews that the Anchorage VOR was temporarily unserviceable. Furthermore, it would not be possible to establish the aircraft on the J501 airway using the Bethel VOR either, because during the takeoff and climb phases, it was out of range. Korean Airlines company procedures did not clearly state what to do when the VOR that would normally be used to locate the INS track was inoperative. However, other flight crews generally solved this issue by using a feature of the inertial navigation system itself called cross-track error. As stated earlier, the INS was aware of the airplane's position relative to the programmed track, and this information was accessible to pilots via the INS display interface in the cockpit, where the horizontal distance between the aircraft and the programmed track was presented as the cross-track error. By monitoring this parameter, pilots could select a heading that caused the cross-track error to decrease, then engage the autopilot INS mode when the cross-track error dropped below 7.5 nm. The reason this was not the default procedure was because tuning to a ground-based VOR would reveal whether the crew had properly entered the starting coordinates, whereas referencing cross-track error would not. For example, if the starting coordinates were off by 1 degree of latitude, then the INS's entire conception of space would also be off by 1 degree of latitude, which would cause the cross-track error to read 0 when the aircraft was 1 degree of latitude away from the intended track. A VOR radial is unaffected by such an error. Little is known about the decision-making of the crew of Flight 007 as they faced down this navigational problem. However, they self-evidently didn't use the cross-track error method because of what followed. As Flight 007 proceeded southwest on heading 220, 2 minutes after takeoff, the Anchorage departure controller transmitted, "Korean Air 007 Heavy, proceed direct Bethel when able." "Roger, proceed direct to Bethel, Roger," First Officer Sun replied. At this time, flight data indicates that the crew engaged the autopilot. Captain Chun then presumably selected heading mode in the autopilot's lateral channel. In this mode, the autopilot steers the plane onto a magnetic heading selected by the pilot, and holds the airplane on that heading until a different heading is selected or a different mode is engaged. In this case, Chun apparently selected a heading of 245 degrees, which was not coincidental. This was the radial of the anchorage VOR that defined the J501 airway. At this point, Flight 007 was fairly close to the airway, so this heading should have approximated the INS track quite well, putting the aircraft within the 7.5 nm buffer zone. The INS mode could then be engaged successfully, but only up to a point, for reasons that we will now examine. The fundamental problem with the actions described above is that the INS navigates with reference to true north, that is, the North Pole. However, aircraft compasses, VOR radio beacons, and other navigational infrastructure all operate with respect to Earth's magnetic field at that particular location. The magnetic field isn't a neat grid spanning the Earth's surface. It has lobes and wobbles, and its center point is at the North Magnetic Pole, which is not always particularly close to the true North Pole and tends to move around. The difference between true north and magnetic north, that is, where a compass points, is called magnetic declination. In Anchorage, the local magnetic declination in 1983 was about 24 degrees east of true north. In parts of the world far from the magnetic pole, the local declination changes little even over vast distances. But in places closer to the pole, such as Alaska, there can be a rather large difference in local declination from one area to the next. Consider the case of the J501 airway. When standing on the Anchorage VOR, the heading to Bethel was 245 degrees. However, if you were to point your aircraft toward 245 degrees at Anchorage, then fly in a perfectly straight line, by the time you got to the halfway point at the Cairn Mountain NDB, your magnetic heading would now be 243 degrees, even though you made no turns. And in fact, you'd still be on course to overfly Bethel as planned. That's because the local magnetic declination at Cairn Mountain is 22 degrees, not 24. The angle between your flight path and Bethel hasn't changed, but the position of north has, which results in your magnetic heading changing proportionally, even though you're not turning. However, if you're flying with an autopilot that has a heading mode, and you depart Anchorage with a selected heading of 245 degrees, then the autopilot is going to make constant small course adjustments to maintain that magnetic heading, even though the position of north is changing. In that case, as local magnetic declination decreases, the autopilot will keep imperceptibly steering to the right in order to make up for the decrease, causing the aircraft to diverge from the intended flight path. To put it another way, if you were still headed directly toward Bethel, then your heading at Cairn Mountain should be 243 degrees, which means that if it's still 245 degrees, then you're 2 degrees right of track. In the case of Korean Air Flight 007, the flight crew apparently engaged the autopilot in heading mode with a selected heading of 245 degrees at a time, approximately 3 minutes after takeoff. By then, they were within the 7.5 nm band either side of the nav track and could have engaged INS mode at any time. However, as long as the autopilot continued to maintain a heading of 245 degrees, their path would slowly diverge to the right of the INS track because of the decreasing local magnetic declination, as we discussed earlier. That meant that if the pilots waited too long to engage INS mode, the aircraft might drift outside the 7.5 nm engagement window. It is unknown to this day whether the crew of Flight 007 actually selected INS mode or not. If the crew simply forgot to switch over from heading mode, then the aircraft would have continued to maintain 245 degrees indefinitely, which, spoiler alert, is what happened. However, this mistake is improbable for a couple of reasons. For one, the Boeing 747's autopilot control panel prominently displayed the selected mode, which would have read heading. The position of the autopilot mode switch would also be wrong. A more plausible hypothesis is that the flight crew waited to select INS mode until they had already reached their cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. If this was the case, then INS mode was likely selected after they had already drifted more than 7.5 ENM to the right of the programmed track. According to air traffic control records, at 13:27 UTC Anchorage area control transmitted, Korean Air 007, radar service is terminated, contact center on 125.2, handing the flight over to the next sector. At this point, Flight 007 was passing Cairn Mountain, which represented the western limit of Anchorage's radar coverage. Military radar in King Salmon would continue to track the flight until well past Bethel, but while this radar was displayed in the Anchorage Control Center, it was not approved for controlling civilian aircraft, and for all practical purposes, radar tracking of Flight 007 ceased at Cairn Mountain. At that moment, the flight was still climbing through 30,000 feet and was already more than 6 nautical miles north of the INS track. The farther west Flight 007 flew, the faster it diverged from the INS track, and the deviation would have exceeded 7.5 nm within a very short time after reaching 31,000 feet. If at that point the flight crew finally selected INS mode, the mode would have armed, but it would not have engaged. There is good reason to believe that this is what the crew did. Korean Airlines Company procedures apparently called for flight crews to engage the INS only once they were in range of the Oceanic Gate, which in this case was the Bethel VOR. This VOR would first become detectable at about 175 nautical miles' distance, or a few minutes flying time beyond Cairn Mountain. Deviation to the right of track was approximately 8 nm at that point. Switching to INS mode at this point would have resulted in a number of insidious indications. For one, in 1983, the Boeing 747 was not capable of simultaneously displaying an armed mode alongside an active mode. On modern aircraft, there are separate display fields for armed and active modes, but Flight 007 had only one display slot, which defaulted to the armed mode. That meant that if the crew selected INS mode while outside the engagement window, the indicated mode would have changed from heading to INS armed. However, the autopilot would have continued to operate in heading mode until the conditions for INS mode engagement were met, which they never would be, since the aircraft was diverging farther from the track with every passing moment. There would have been no direct indication that heading mode was still active, other than the fact that their heading was not changing. However, only minor heading changes were expected at a couple of points along the intended route, so this discrepancy would hardly have been attention-grabbing. To make matters even worse, the INS was turned on, and it was tracking the flight's progress relative to the programmed waypoints. An INS is not so accurate as to take the aircraft directly over the waypoint every single time, so the system was programmed to detect when the aircraft crossed a beam the waypoint, rather than over it. Therefore, when Flight 007 crossed an imaginary line running perpendicular to the intended track at Cairn Mountain, the INS would have informed the crew that they were passing Cairn Mountain, even though the aircraft was actually 6 nm north of the waypoint. This could have created an illusion that the aircraft was on course. Furthermore, at the time the INS mode was presumably selected, a cross-check with the Bethel VOR may not have revealed the error. The difference between the expected and actual bearing from the VOR to the aircraft at Cairn Mountain would have been less than the margin of error of the VOR equipment. Nevertheless, even at this early stage, there were several ways for the crew to detect that something was wrong. The most obvious would have been the cross-track error parameter on the INS display described previously. Additionally, the INS display included the actual coordinates of the aircraft, which could have been cross-checked with the desired position to uncover the error. The autopilot mode indication would also have been illuminated in amber, whereas it would have been green if the INS mode was engaged. One can only conclude that if this was indeed what happened, then the flight crew did not examine their navigation display and did not perceive that the mode indication was incorrect. Air traffic controllers could in theory have detected that Flight 007 was 6 nm north of track at Cairn Mountain, but there was no requirement for controllers to cross-check an aircraft's position when terminating radar service, and they did not do so. This was because Flight 007's clearance was direct to Bethel, not via any specific airway. Thus, the flight was under own navigation and could get to Bethel however it wanted. Whether it adhered to the center line of the airway specified in the company flight plan was not, at that point, ATC's concern. After leveling off at 31,000 feet, the flight proceeded without incident. What the flight crew were doing is unknown, but at 1350 they reported crossing Bethel and estimated waypoint Nabi at 1430. By that point, the aircraft was 12 nm north of track, but no comment about this was made. The King Salmon radar continued to track Flight 407 for a short time beyond this point, but after that it disappeared into the vast expanse of the Bering Sea. Although no radar accessible to civilians tracked the aircraft past Bethel, Flight 007 was nevertheless proceeding through airspace considered critical to United States military interests. U.S. and Soviet territory lay within sight of each other in the Bering Strait, and both Alaska and Far Eastern Russia were packed with military installations, from radar to listening stations to air bases. Large parts of the Bering Sea were actually radar monitored by the U.S. military for the purpose of enforcing the U.S. Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. In the U.S., aircraft flying into, within, or out of an ADIZ are subject to certain requirements under 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 99, Subpart A. In practice, however, these requirements are pretty basic. One must have a radio turned to the appropriate ATC frequency. One must have an operating transponder. One must have a flight plan specifying the locations and times of entry into and exit from the ADIZ. And one must leave the ADIZ within 5 minutes of the departure time, listed in the flight plan. All commercial aircraft already comply with these requirements on any revenue flight, regardless of whether they plan to enter an ADIZ. The regulation does also require that aircraft report the time, position, and altitude at which they crossed the last waypoint before entering the ADIZ, which in the case of Flight 007 was met when the crew reported crossing Bethel at 31,000 feet and time 1349. In practice, there were no special procedures whose omission or non-compliance would have led to Flight 007 attracting military attention when it entered the Alaska ADIZ. Within the ADIZ, the U.S. military reserved the right to contact and intercept any aircraft that it deemed suspicious, but a flight carrying a commercial transponder and proceeding westbound from Alaska on a steady course and altitude would not have generated any interest whatsoever. According to long-standing practice, the U.S. military ignored commercial traffic within the NOPAC system, and no communication with civilian controllers about this traffic normally took place. Military radar operators in the region paid no attention to Flight 007, and there is no direct evidence that anyone at these facilities noticed that the flight was off course. The Anchorage ATC tapes did capture a distant voice at 1434 that might have been saying, "Persons should warn them," but the voice was too faint to be read clearly. It is believed that this statement was made over an unrecorded landline, and it's unknown whether the above interpretation is correct or whom the statement concerned. This can hardly be considered evidence that anyone was aware of KAL 007's deviation from course, nor was there any particular reason why the flight should have attracted U.S. military attention. Normally, as aircraft proceed along Route R20, communication with air traffic control is maintained over VHF radio via a repeater on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea. An area outside VHF radio range exists around waypoint NUKKS, which is not a mandatory reporting point, before radio coverage resumes at waypoint Neva via a repeater at Shemya in the Aleutian Islands. However, because Flight 007 was diverging north of the standard route, it flew out of range of the St. Paul repeater and VHF communication with ATC was lost. At 1432, 2 minutes after KAL 007 had estimated they would reach waypoint Nabi, the Anchorage Oceanic Controller made several attempts to call Flight 007 without success. At 1433, an unintelligible transmission from the flight was heard. Simultaneously, the flight data recorder indicated that the crew of Flight 007 made several unsuccessful attempts to call ATC. At 14:34, several phrases in Korean were heard, presumably internal cockpit chatter with the microphone open. "Ah, it was cut out. Would you try to call again?" "Unable to get flight level 330, wait for a while." Although ATC was unable to hear any clear transmissions from Flight 007, another aircraft was in range. KAL Flight 015, also bound for Seoul, departed Anchorage 15 minutes behind Flight 007 and was also proceeding down Route R20, while the crew chatted with Flight 007. The crew of Flight 007 must have decided that KAL 015 could relay their position report, because at 14:35 the latter flight transmitted, "Korean Air 015, forwarding report. Korean Air 007 position, Navy 1432, flight level 310, estimating NEVA 1549. Korean Air 015, Roger. Have Korean Air 007 report, NEVA to Anchorage Center on 128.2, the controller replied. As Flight 007 approached Navy, the INS display would have indicated that the cross-track error was 60 nm. The distance to go parameter, which normally falls to 0 as the waypoint approaches, also would not have fallen below 60 nm. Nevertheless, the INS alert light, which illuminates when approaching a waypoint, would have operated normally as the aircraft approached the perpendicular of Navy. It's possible that the flight crew was only watching for the alert light, even though cross-track error checks in oceanic airspace are required. However, their horizontal situation indicators, essentially crude, mechanical moving maps displaying an airplane symbol in relation to a program track, would have been pinned at maximum right-of-course deflection. Long-range navigation procedures also specified that upon waypoint passage, the flight crew should cross-check the coordinates of their actual position against the ATC clearance, observe any course change associated with that waypoint, and plot the present position on a chart. Evidently, the HSIs were overlooked, and none of these checks were performed, or if they were, the crew for some reason ignored the conflicting indications. Between 14:55 and approximately 15:50, Flight 007 flew for another hour without attempting to contact Anchorage Control or KAL 015. What the crew were doing during this time is unknown. If we want to descend into base speculation, I would not be shocked if they were simply asleep. However, there's no evidence one way or the other, and at 16 KAL 015 reported to Anchorage Control that KAL 007 had crossed waypoint NEVA at 15:58, estimating NIPI at 17:08. It does not appear that the two crews discussed why Flight 007 had taken 9 minutes longer to reach NEVA than estimated, nor did they discuss at this stage why Flight 015, which took off 15 minutes behind Flight 007, crossed NEVA only 5 minutes behind it. Alternatively, if they did, then the discrepancy failed to stir the pilots from their incorrect conception of the situation. It must be noted that any discussion between the two crews was on an unrecorded company VHF frequency and has been lost forever. However, judging by the fact that Flight 007 remained off course, we can assume that the discrepancies were not examined in detail. On the ground, the Anchorage controller called their counterpart in Tokyo and informed them of the approach of KAL flights 007 and 015, now flying at 33,000 and 35,000 feet, respectively. No mention was made of KAL 007's radio difficulties. At this point, Flight 007 had been proceeding in a generally southwest direction, maintaining the selected heading of 245 degrees, with minor track variations in response to changes in the local magnetic declination. Had Flight 007 remained on this course, it would, coincidentally, have ended up in the general area of its destination after a number of hours. But first, this track would take the flight across the Kamchatka Peninsula in far eastern Russia. And while neither the pilots or controllers appreciated this fact, there were others who had already noticed. Until 1989, several large areas of the Soviet Union were off-limits to foreign visitors for military and national security reasons, of which the Kamchatka Peninsula was arguably one of the strictest. Much as the United States maintained a large military presence in Alaska, the USSR heavily militarized Kamchatka, and the peninsula was dotted with sensitive defense installations and intelligence posts. U.S. and Soviet forces continuously monitored each other's activities across the Bering Strait and regularly staged provocations in order to gauge their opponents' reactions and assess their capabilities. When Flight 007 departed Anchorage in Kamchatka, the local time was approximately midnight on the morning of September 1, 1983, nearly a full day ahead of Alaska, which lay across the international date line. U.S. intelligence believed that Soviet forces would conduct a ballistic missile test in Kamchatka early that morning, and all ears were on deck to monitor the exercise. Much of that monitoring took place from the air, aboard a U.S. Air Force Boeing RC-135 dispatched from Shemya Air Base in the Aleutian Islands. The RC-135 is a large four-engine reconnaissance aircraft developed from the KC-135 fuel tanker, itself a sibling of sorts to the civilian Boeing 707, to which it bears considerable resemblance. Numerous RC-135 variants exist, but the version that would have been flying that night was an RC-135S Cobra Ball that was specifically designed to monitor missile activity in Kamchatka using extremely sensitive launch detection and tracking equipment. The Cobra Ball aircraft were used as part of a three-pronged monitoring network, also involving a powerful military radar called Cobra Dane, located at Shemya Air Base, and another radar called Cobra Judy, which was mounted on the U.S. Navy reconnaissance vessel Observation Island. That night, one Cobra Ball aircraft was circling off the coast of Kamchatka, just outside Soviet airspace, scanning the region for evidence of a ballistic missile launch. In turn, Soviet radar stations and listening posts were tracking the RC-135 and monitoring its communications. This situation was ongoing when, at 15:51, an unidentified target appeared on Soviet radars, tracking southwestbound toward the peninsula at 33,000 feet. It is not known exactly how the initial reaction to this target unfolded, because the available transcripts of military communications don't begin until approximately 1720. However, according to Russian testimony, observers first believed that the target was a KC-135 tanker coming to provide mid-air refueling to the RC-135. This would have been a reasonable interpretation, as this kind of operation was common. But on the other hand, this interpretation also led to the target's erroneous classification as military, an assumption that was never adequately reconsidered. The target was, of course, Flight 007. The 747's transponder would even have been broadcasting a civilian code, but this isn't mentioned in any available documents, so it's probably safe to assume that the Soviet military radar was not capable of interrogating a Western civilian transponder. Instead, the target was assigned the track number 6065 and was verbally indicated to be a KC-135. However, when the target did not rendezvous with the RC-135, observers concluded that it was most likely a second RC-135 from the same airbase. There was no direct evidence for this assumption, except that a large aircraft approaching the coast of Kamchatka from Alaska was, in their experience, usually either a KC-135 or an RC-135. Although some accounts describe track 6065 appearing on screen as the RC-135 was leaving, causing observers to conflate the two aircraft, this does not appear to have been the case. The RC-135 did eventually leave the area after U.S. intelligence determined that the ballistic missile test had been canceled. However, this didn't occur until 1649, nearly an hour after track 6065 appeared on radar. The tracks of the two aircraft did not cross until well after track 6065 had been identified as military, and the minimum proximity between the two aircraft was 75 nautical miles. Based on military communications, it is self-evidently true that Soviet air defense personnel believed that Track 6065 was an RC-135, but it's improbable that they believed it was the same RC-135 that had been in the area. Although the identification of the target as military was too hasty, the air defense forces did make some effort to cover their bases by contacting the civilian air traffic control centers for Kamchatka and Khabarovsk. However, Flight KAL 007 was never supposed to be in contact with these control centers, so they were unaware of its presence. The civilian controllers simply stated that there were no Soviet commercial aircraft operating in the area of Track 6065. The possibility that the target was a foreign commercial aircraft was not considered, and no attempt was made to contact foreign air traffic control centers. Presumably, this is because foreign airliners did not fly over Kamchatka. As Track 6065 continued moving steadily in the direction of Kamchatka, maintaining a southwesterly heading, regional air defense commanders believed that the course of the airplane and the content of American radio chatter resembled previous incidents in which U.S. military aircraft intentionally violated Soviet airspace. The immediate question of how to respond would have fallen to General Valery Kamensky, Air Force commander of the Far Eastern Military District, which included Kamchatka. According to an interview that Kamensky gave to Ukrainian periodical Fakty Iyun Komentary many years after the incident, he had received an official reprimand for inadequately persistent actions at scramble takeoff during an incident in which an aircraft from the USS Midway entered Soviet airspace in the spring of 1983. This time, it seemed, he didn't want to take any chances. At 16:33, Flight 007 entered Soviet airspace in the vicinity of the Kronotsky Peninsula on the east coast of Kamchatka. Fighter jets were scrambled sometime during this time frame, but it's unclear when. Official reports state that at least 4 jets were scrambled without a timestamp provided. That's while the Russian commentary vaguely indicates that the target was accompanied by interceptor fighters, without saying when or where. Radar data plots of the activity over Kamchatka only show 2 intercepting aircraft, one of which was launched at 1642 and the other at 1644, which was well after the target entered Soviet airspace. At 1637, while the target was over the Kronotsky Peninsula, it was temporarily lost from radar for unclear reasons. According to Soviet fighter pilot Alexander Zuyev, who defected to the U.S. in 1989, Arctic gales had knocked out part of the early warning radar in Kamchatka 10 days before the incident, and local military authorities failed to meet a Moscow-imposed deadline to repair the damage. However, Zuyev did not have first-hand knowledge of the events, so it's impossible to say whether this was the true reason for the loss of contact with Flight 007. What is known is that during this outage, air defense personnel plotted a projected path for the aircraft based on their experience with previous border intrusions. This plot predicted that the aircraft would turn left after crossing the Kronotsky Peninsula in order to exit Soviet airspace over Kronotsky Bay before potentially staging another intrusion farther down the coast. This method of intrusion is typical of military aircraft intending to test an adversary's air defenses without remaining in hostile airspace for long enough to be attacked. Due to the assumption that target 6065 would behave in this manner, it appears as though both interceptor aircraft were initially directed east to intercept the target as it proceeded southbound along Kamchatka's east coast. However, at 1646, the target reappeared on radar, still proceeding on its original southwesterly heading across the main portion of the Kamchatka Peninsula. The radar plots indicated that the fighters were subsequently directed to turn around and fly west between 1648 and 1650. By that point, the interceptors had spent about 6 minutes flying away from the direction of the target, which was traveling at nearly 500 knots ground speed. It's highly probable that this blunder prevented the fighters from catching up with the target before it exited Soviet airspace on the west coast of Kamchatka at 17:08. The radar plot shows that both fighters were turned away at 17:06, when it became clear that the target was about to fly over international waters, although one of the fighters does appear to have come as close as 5 kilometers from the target in the process of turning around. Alternatively, reporting in 1991 by Soviet newspaper Izvestia suggested that the fighters could have pursued the aircraft into international waters had they not been deliberately underfueled, allegedly to prevent pilots from defecting by flying their fighters to Japan. In any case, the result of the failed interception was that Flight 007 managed to cross Kamchatka completely unscathed, after which it proceeded southwest across the vast Sea of Okhotsk. Although this sea was almost totally surrounded by Soviet airspace, it does border Japan at its southern tip, and most of the sea is considered international waters. With no other Soviet territory in the immediate path of the airplane, there was no longer any justification to intercept, even if sufficient fuel had been available. However, military commanders were well aware that if the target continued on its present heading, it would eventually cross back into Soviet airspace over Sakhalin Island, a long, narrow island positioned northeast of Vladivostok and directly north of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. This would eventually cause the aircraft to enter the zone of responsibility of the Soviet Air Force 40th Fighter Aviation Division. This division consisted of the 528th and 777th Fighter Regiments, based at Smirnik and Sokol-Dolinsk air bases on Sakhalin Island, and the 41st Fighter Regiment, based at Burevestnik in the southern Kuril Islands. Soviet Air Force 40th Fighter Aviation Division. This division consisted of the 528th and 777th Fighter Regiments, based at Smirnik, and at 1723, tapes captured Captain Kudapov, a combat control officer for the 40th Fighter Division, briefing Major Kostenko, the operations duty officer at the 40th Fighter Division Combat Control Center. So, for your information, target now in the Elizovo region, Kamchatka. It will be target 6065, type unidentified, border violation. Just a moment. So this is what we need. It's now been designated a type unidentified target, that is, without identification signal, now tracking 240 degrees somewhere over the Sea of Okhotsk, so it crossed Elizovo, going to Okhotsk, heading roughly towards us. I've looked at the plane. We have to check routes of our long-range aircraft. Is someone flying there with those long-range aircraft or not? Could that airplane be ours? I'll call the zone right away, but they would hardly be there now, said Major Kostenko. Well, you haven't opened anything there. No requests from long-range aircraft, right? Kudapov asked. No, said Kostenko. Well, we need to find out if one of ours is flying out there, Kudapov repeated. Okay, I'll find out right away, Kostenko promised. Shortly thereafter, Kostenko could be heard ordering pilots to be seated and ready and calling officers to the command post. Simultaneously, a meteorological report could be heard, stating that Burevestnik and Smirnik air bases were both below minimums, with dense fog that would prevent scrambled fighters from returning. Only Sokol Air Base was above minimums, albeit still under instrument conditions. At 17:26, Kostenko asked a switchboard operator to get me Kornikov's apartment, referring to General Anatoly Kornikov, commander of the 40th Fighter Division. That same minute, all 3 fighter regiments within the 40th Division were placed on alert. 1 minute later, the phone rang in Kornikov's apartment. The local time was 4:30 in the morning. Comrade General, said Kostenko, excuse me for waking you. We have a 00, code for an alert. At 4 o'clock there was a border violation in the Elizovo area, an RC-135, now tracking 240 over the Sea of Okhotsk, moving toward us. That's all for the moment. Distance somewhere around 500 kilometers, a beam Noglikovo. Okay, brief the officer on duty, Kornikov replied. The officer on duty has been briefed. Car number 02 is on its way to you, said Kostenko. "Okay, I'm getting dressed, that's all," said Kornikov. Moments later, at 1728, Captain Kutapov, the combat control officer, briefed another superior officer, Major Valyuntovich, about the situation, mentioning that the target was provisionally an RC-135. Valyuntovich's role is not specified in the documentation, but he appears to have been delegated by Kostenko to determine whether the target was a Soviet long-range flight, because at 1729 he said, "Uh-huh, well, I just talked with the zone. They say none of ours are there, none on that route. So that is exactly what I reported to the controller at the zone. He says none of ours are there." At 1731, the transcripts show that the command post duty officer at Sokol Air Base, Captain Solodkov, requested to wake Colonel Berminsky, the deputy commander of the 40th Fighter Division. After hearing the same briefing, Berminsky asked, "Did they send anyone up there?" "Well, yes, Elizovo sent someone up, but couldn't catch it. High speed, altitude 9,000 meters, speed 900 kilometers per hour," said Solodkov, referring to the earlier interception attempt in Kamchatka. "Type not identified, eh?" Berminsky asked. "Type not identified, maybe even now. Well, we're checking what kind of target it is. Command has been informed, those higher up have been informed," said Solodkov. "Well, Roger, they've brought us to readiness here too," said Berminsky. "At all points," Solodkov affirmed. At 1736, Senior Lieutenant Kozlov, the fighter controller for Sokol Air Base, reported that 2 Su-15 fighter jets with call signs 121 and 805 were now placed in a state of alert. In response, Colonel Mastrenko, the operations duty officer at the Combat Control Center for the entire Far Eastern Military District Air Force, ordered him to send Fighter 805 into the air. On another line, Captain Solodkov at Sokol Air Base could be heard struggling with a switchboard operator as he tried to contact Burevestnik Air Base. "I need it now, miss. Whatever it takes, but I must call there. It's a matter of national importance, I'm not joking." At 1741, the Fighter Division Combat Control Officer Captain Kutapov ordered a MiG-23 fighter scrambled from Smyrnik Air Base. Conditions at Smyrnik were still below landing minimums, so Sokol was designated as an alternate. At 1742, Fighter 805 took off from Sokol Air Base, piloted by Major Gennady Osipovich. However, at 1743, Colonel Mastrenko countermanded the order to scramble a fighter from Smyrnik, instructing Major Kostenko not to let any pilots take off until the target could be seen on radar, presumably to make sure that they wouldn't run out of fuel before intercepting. Kostenko challenged this order, informing Mastrenko that later will be too late, and it would be better to send a second fighter from Smyrnik with 3 auxiliary fuel tanks. Mastrenko accepted this and ordered the MiG-23 scrambled into the probable path of the target.
At 1746, the MiG-23, call sign 163, took off and began climbing toward the Bay of Terpenia, Bay of Patience, on the east side of Sakhalin Island. At the same time, the Su-15, call sign 805, was already climbing to 8,000 meters to intercept the target, which at this time was still 440 kilometers away from Sokol. At 1749, Captain Solodkov gave an updated briefing to Colonel Berminsky, the deputy commander of the fighter division. "2 pilots have just been sent up, command at the command post. We do not know what is happening just now," said Solodkov. "It's heading straight for our island, to Cape Terpenia. Somehow this all looks very suspicious to me. I don't think the enemy is stupid, so could it be one of ours?" However, Berminsky dismissed Solodkov's doubts and steered the conversation to the details of the scrambled fighters instead. At 1750, a second Su-15, call sign 121, was ordered into the air from Sokol Air Base, while Colonel Mastrenko ordered Fighter 805 directly to the planned interception point. Around the same time, General Kornikov finally arrived at the command post, presumably fully dressed. "Attention! To the command post personnel,"
he said at time 17:53. Target 6065, Moscow time 21:53. Upon violation of state borders, destroy the target. Assign the task to Sokol and Smirnik. Right away, an unidentified officer replied. Well, how will we identify the target? It's night. Well, we'll guide them in, if we see in sunlight, another unidentified officer replied. Well, it's night, the first officer repeated. Simply destroy it, even if it's over neutral waters. Are the orders to destroy it over neutral waters? Someone else asked. The question was not answered by Kornikov or anyone else. In fact, Kornikov was already attempting to contact his superior, General Valery Kamensky, commander of the Far Eastern Military District Air Force. Moments later, at 17:54, Fighter 121 took off from Sokol, chasing after Fighter 805. Simultaneously, the tapes captured General Kornikov on the phone with General Kamensky. In a bizarre twist, it has to be noted that General Kornikov would go on to become the commander of the Russian Air Force between 1998 and 2002, while General Kamensky ended up as the deputy commander of the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces during the same time period. As of creating this video, Ukraine and Russia are at war, but in 1983 Kamensky was Kornikov's direct superior. I will be at the command post. Target 6065 is in the air. Provisionally an RC-135, Kornikov said. What is happening? Do you see it or what? Kamensky asked. We see it, and we are providing guidance. 2 fighters have gone up already. They had to send them up below minima, Kornikov reported. By this time, target 6065 was close enough to appear on radar in Smirnich. At that airbase, the command post officer of the TU as 528th Fighter Regiment reported, I have contact. The acting chief of staff of the fighter division, Lieutenant Colonel Novoseletsky, replied, Good. Military target. To be destroyed if it violates the state border. There was no mention of the fact that the identification of the aircraft as military was still provisional only, as Kornikov had just reported to the regional commander. At 17:55, Novoseletsky transmitted the same order to Sokol command post officer. The commander has assigned your task. First, send 121 and 805 to intercept target 6065. If the border is violated, destroy the target. Military target, he said. In the air, the fighter controller for Sokol Air Base could be heard communicating with Fighter 805. The target is at 5 degrees to the left, distance 130 kilometers, he said. Target is on heading 240. At 17:58, General Kornikov briefed Lieutenant Colonel Gerasimenko, the acting commander of the 41st Fighter Regiment, Burevestnik Air Base, along with his counterpart at Smirnich. However, from the contents of the transcript, it appears that Gerasimenko was also in charge of the 777th Regiment operating out of Sokol, even though this is not specified in official documents. The intruder violated the state border in the area of Kamchatka, Kornikov began. Upon entering the area of responsibility and violation of the state border, destroy the target. It is a real target. I anticipate real use of weapons. Act with an understanding of the situation. Sokol, Gerasimenko, do you see the target on your screen? Do you see it or not? Bring Osipovich, Fighter 805, in to follow the target and identify it. Hold at a distance that will ensure engagement and immediate strike. Unintelligible, draw yours up into that area as well. Hold off at a distance behind Article 37 operating out of Sokol Fighter 805, at a distance of 10 to 11 kilometers from the target, no more. Gerasimenko, you are 5 kilometers in the aft hemisphere. If necessary, the target will be destroyed. For the moment, it is beyond the 100 kilometers waters. Do you understand the task? Task understood, the commanders replied. Execute, said Kornikov. If necessary, Gerasimenko, bring in the second fighter as well and act until the target is destroyed. Get to it, please. In the background, Captain Solodkov at Sokol Air Base could be heard talking to Major Valyuntovich at the Combat Control Office. Something serious is going on there, isn't there? Valyuntovich asked. Yes, it looks serious, said Solodkov. Like on the 4th, but a bit worse. Well, you did everything normally, like an alert, right? Valyuntovich asked. Oh no, right now are just about to guide him in, said Solodkov. Ah, is everything going okay? Said Valyuntovich. For the moment, God knows I don't, Solodkov replied cryptically. At the so-called command post, General Kornikov was now issuing orders directly to the base's fighter controller, Senior Lieutenant Kozlov. Give me the bearing and range of the target, bearing and range of the interceptor, please, he said. So, target bearing 55, range 250 kilometers, said Kozlov. Interceptor bearing 55, range 235. Is there what, about 25 kilometers between them? Said Kornikov. Well, now he has it on his right at 90. That's where the target is. They are now guiding him up in the aft hemisphere for identification, said Kozlov. Does the target have no identification? Kornikov asked. They are guiding him in for identification. Guiding him in, I say. Bring him up. Bring Osipovich. Fighter 805 in to the prescribed distance, Kornikov orders. You do not engage him to the target from the after-aft hemisphere. You do not engage him right on his tail. Keep the angle of approach. Roger, executing, said Kozlov. Don't forget it. The target has cannons in the rear, there, Kornikov explained. Obviously, the Boeing 747 does not have a rear tail gunner position, but neither does the RC-135, so it's unclear what Kornikov was referring to. Up above, with the target now entering the USSR's air defense identification zone, the controller ordered Fighter 805 to turn left, heading 240 to parallel the target. At the Combat Control Center, Major Kostenko called Colonel Maestrenko and said, So, the commander at the command post has set the task. If the target enters the 100-kilometer zone now, the task has been set. To follow it? Affirmative, said Kostenko. If the state border is violated, we destroy the target. Wait? Affirmative. Uh-huh. Identify? Maestrenko asked. Well, everything, of course, in accordance with the rules, Kostenko said. Everything in accordance with the rules, Maestrenko agreed. Meanwhile, at 18:05, the so-called fighter regiment command post officer reported to General Kornikov. So, 805 is beside the target at a range of 8 kilometers. Can he see the target? Kornikov asked. He cannot see the target for the moment. Roger, bring him closer for identification, Kornikov ordered. Simultaneously, the so-called fighter controller, Kozlov, callsign Deputat, said, 805, Deputat, the target is military. Upon violation of state border, destroy the target. Arm the weapons. Once again, somewhere in the game of telephone, the officers had lost track of the fact that the military nature of the target was never verified. Coming in behind 805, the MiG-23-163 reported jettisoning its auxiliary fuel tanks. Moments later, Deputat asked 805, Do you see the target? Major Osipovich, the pilot of 805, replied, Yes, I do. This was the first time anyone had conclusively laid eyes on the target since the incident began. At this point, both 805 and 163 were following the target from a position behind and to the right, with 805 maintaining about 8 to 12 kilometers of separation from the target. As Fighter 805 took up position, doubt still remained about what was really going on. On one tape, Captain Solodkov of Sokol Air Base could be heard speaking to an unidentified person. So, it seems to us this border intruder, something like our 295, I hope nothing bad has happened. I'll ask right away, right? I'll find out, the person replied. It's very suspicious, extremely, the altitude and track and speed, Solodkov concluded, but he was unable to elaborate. Still overseeing the situation from the so-called command post, General Kornikov ordered Fighter 805 to be brought in closer, to 3 kilometers from the target. The so-called fighter controller Kozlov, Deputat, reported that 805 was already at 4 kilometers. But plotted radar data doesn't support the notion that he ever got so close to the target. In fact, the plot shows that 805 was consistently about 1 minute behind the target, which at such high speed works out to around kilometers. At 1808, Kozlov reported, "He has the target in sight." "He can see it?" Kornikov asked. "How many jet trails are coming from it? How many jet trails are there? If there are 4 jet trails, then it's an RC-135. There are obviously many airplanes other than the RC-135 that have 4 engines. Kornikov was setting a confirmation bias trap into which he had already begun to fall. At 1810, Deputat asked 805, "Can you determine the type?" Major Osipovich provided a terse one-word reply, "Unclear." "Roger, 12 kilometers to the target," Deputat transmitted. "It is flying with flashing lights," 805 added. That would have struck him as odd. Why would a military intruder fly with such conspicuous lighting? In the command post, Kozlov continued to relay everything to Kornikov. "He sees it, 4.5 to 5 kilometers. He cannot determine the type," he said, misstating the distance to the target. "He cannot determine the type?" Kornikov asked. "No way. It is dark, dark," said Kozlov. "Turn on radar in high mode. Prepare to lock on. Give the order to fire on our command," Kornikov ordered. In the background, Solodkov's conversation with an unidentified person continued. "So I called the zone. They say there is nothing of ours in the air," the person reported, for the second time that night. "Well, what is it then? Where is it going?" Solodkov asked. "Well, it is south of Terpania, somewhere about kilometers, heading straight for our island," the person replied. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Colonel Novoseletsky, Fighter Division Acting Chief of Staff, was speaking with Captain Titovnin, the fighter controller for the Fighter Division Combat Control Center. Titovnin informed him that the target was 110 kilometers from their position, on bearing 45, altitude 9,000 meters. "With lights, without lights?" Novoseletsky asked. "Without for the moment," Titovnin erroneously replied. In the air, Major Osipovich continued to receive orders from the so-called fighter controller, Deputat. 805, set to lock-on mode, the controller instructed. "Wilco," said Osipovich. "Can you see the target, 805? Deputat asked. "I can see it both visually and on the screen," Osipovich replied. At the Sokol command post, Kornikov asked, "Well, where is that Osipovich? Is he flying alongside?" "He is 10 kilometers from it," the regimental command post officer replied. "Well, why 10, expletive?" I said. "I don't understand. Do you think he can identify the target at 10 kilometers?" Kornikov asked, incredulous. "It is at an altitude of 11,000 according to reports," the officer said. "So what?" Kornikov exclaimed. "What don't you understand?" I said. "Bring him up to a range of 4 kilometers, 4 to 5 kilometers. Identify the target. You understand that weapons are going to have to be used now, and you are holding him at a range of 10. Give the pilot his orders." In the background, Solodkov continued his conversation with the unidentified officer. "Yes, well, I say that is much too stupid to be an intruder," he said, repeating his earlier sentiment. "What is happening? How is it going as of the last check?" the officer asked. "It was tracking 240 south of Terpania, distance kilometers," Solodkov explained. "Well, in the Makarov area, it is going straight like this. I say, unintelligible. Include everything you can. Short-range radio navigation system, because, well, an intruder can't operate that way. That's according to us. You are fine sitting below." "Well, it's not fate the way it turned out. In that case, we have here," said the officer. "It hasn't bombed us," said Solodkov. At the Combat Control Center, Novoseletsky continued speaking to Titovnin, the fighter controller for the division. "For the moment, the pilot cannot see anything," Titovnin reported. "So, but our fighters are flying with lights, aren't they?" Novoseletsky asked. Of course, ours are flying with lights, said Titovnin. So ours are also without lights. Are you sure the target is without lights? Novoseletsky asked. I'll find out right now, Titovnin promised. In the air, Osipovich received new orders from the so-called fighter controller. 805, interrogate the target, Deputat instructed. This transmission was referring to the IFF, Identification Friend or Foe system, that would allow Soviet fighters to determine whether an aircraft was one of their own, regardless of whether it was military or civilian. However, the Boeing 747, not being a Soviet airplane, was not equipped to respond to a Soviet IFF interrogation, so there was no response. This was also what they would expect from a hostile aircraft. The target is not responding to the call, Osipovich replied. No response from the target, Comrade General, the so-called regimental command post officer reported to General Kornikov. No response, Roger. Be ready to fire. The target is 45-50 kilometers from the state border, said Kornikov. At that moment, Kornikov called the command post for the whole Far Eastern Military District. Please put Kamensky on the line, he said, referring once again to his superior. Kamensky here, General Kamensky answered. Comrade General, said Kornikov. Good morning. I'm reporting the situation. Target 6065 is over Terpenia Bay, tracking 240, 30 kilometers from the state border. The fighter from Sokol is 6 kilometers away. Locked on, orders were given to arm weapons. The target is not responding to identify. He cannot identify it visually because it is still dark, but he is locked on. We must find out, said Kamensky. Maybe it is some civilian craft or God knows who, he said. This inkling of doubt from the lips of the officer in charge of the entire Far Eastern Air Force perhaps should have carried more weight than it did. But before the matter could be examined more carefully, Kornikov shut Kamensky down. What civilian it has flown over Kamchatka? It came from the ocean without identification, he said. I am giving the order to attack if it crosses the state border. Go ahead now, I order. Unclear, Kamensky said. The questioning tone is in the transcript. Yes, sir, Kornikov declared. Over the airwaves, the fighter controller transmitted, 805, Deputat, prepare to fire. Roger, my speed, was unclear on the recording. And I have to turn on the afterburner, Osipovich reported. Afterburners on command, said Deputat. Addressing Lieutenant Colonel Gerasimenko, acting commander of the regiment, General Kornikov said, Be ready to fire. Bring everything to ready status. I will give Osipovich the order in 2 minutes or even less. In a minute and a half, I will give the order to open fire. Bring Tarasov, Fighter 121, into the same area. Meanwhile, in the Combat Control Center, the fighter controller Titovnin contacted Colonel Maestrenko, the operations duty officer. The commander has given orders that if the border is violated, destroy the target, he said. Was unclear on the recording. Maybe a passenger aircraft, said Maestrenko. All necessary steps must be taken to identify it. Evidently, he and General Kamensky were traveling on the same train of thought. Identification measures are being taken, but the pilot cannot see, said Titovnin. It's dark. Even now, it's still dark. Well, okay, said Maestrenko. The task is correct. If there are no lights, it cannot be a passenger aircraft. Recall that minutes earlier, Titovnin had erroneously reported to Novoseletsky that the target was flying without lights. Now, the same misconception had been transmitted to Maestrenko, even though Osipovich had reported the opposite to his local fighter controller 5 minutes ago. Why Titovnin thought the target was flying without lights is unknown, but his insistence that this was the case clearly helped convince his superior officers that the target couldn't be civilian. You confirm the task? Titovnin asked. Yes, Maestrenko replied, casting away his doubts. At the Fighter Division Combat Control Center, Novoseletsky was back on the phone with Berminsky, deputy commander of the fighter division, who had been out of the loop this whole time. "Well, what is happening there? Have you sorted it out?" Berminsky naively asked. "Well, for the time being, we cannot identify. What it is, the pilot only sees a shadow," Novoseletsky said, again relaying the false information about the status of the target's lights. "Well, but it did not turn away? Is it still flying that way?" Berminsky asked. "No, it is headed straight for Shkolny, that is towards Uryuk, said Novoseletsky, naming locations on Sakhalin. Meanwhile, Kornikov contacted Lieutenant Colonel Gerasimenko, who was now responsible for both intercepting fighters, and said, "Ask Osipovich whether there are any navigation lights. Are there any navigation lights?" "Say again." "Are the enemy's navigation lights on or not?" Kornikov repeated. "Ask whether or not the navigation lights are on." "I did not understand," Gerasimenko said. Clearly angry, Kornikov said, "Nav lights, are they on or not?" Before the question received an answer, at time 1817, the target entered Soviet airspace on the east coast of Sakhalin Island. "Target 6065 violated the state border of the USSR, said Kornikov. "I order you to destroy the target." "Roger, I am issuing the order," said Gerasimenko. But Kornikov still felt the creeping shadow of doubt. "Are there nav lights or not?" he continued. "Are there nav lights or not?" "I issued the order to destroy the target," said Gerasimenko. At that moment, Deputat contacted Osipovich and said, 805, the target has violated the state border. Destroy the target." "Wilko," said Osipovich. "Are there nav lights or not?" Kornikov demanded. "Gerasimenko." "Comrade General, I still do not understand," said Gerasimenko. "I am asking, well, ask the pilot. Does the target have nav lights or not?" Kornikov repeated. At that moment, Osipovich himself broke in with the answer. "The air navigation light is on. The flashing light is on," he reported. Within seconds, this news was relayed to Kornikov. "There are nav lights?" he exclaimed. "Who said so?" "There are nav lights, Comrade General," said Gerasimenko. Kornikov must have heard the faint voice of conscience in the back of his head, whispering into the maelstrom, telling him that a military intruder wouldn't be flying with its nav lights turned on. The order to shoot it down had already been given. To hesitate now would be almost impossible. What if the target escaped, and it turned out he was wrong? But at the last moment, he decided to order a few extra checks anyway. "Flash the interceptor's lights to it. Interrogate, interrogate. Flash navigation lights as a warning signal," he ordered. "Does it answer or not? Tell Osipovich to flash his nav lights. Order him to flash his nav lights." "I issued the order. I ordered him to flash his lights," said Gerasimenko. Relaying the order to Osipovich, Deputat transmitted, 805, flash your lights briefly. "Wilko," said Osipovich. Moments later, Kornikov, his doubts growing, issued a new superseding command. "Gerasimenko," he said. "Order him to approach the fighter, rock, wings, at the fighter, or rather at the target, rock wings at it, and force it to land at Sokol." It seems clear that Kornikov was worried about shooting down an airplane that did not display all the normal signs of a military intruder, and was now seeking alternative options. 163, stand by. 805, force it to land at our aerodrome, Deputat transmitted. 805, Osipovich acknowledged. Still thinking quickly, Kornikov asked, "Gerasimenko, is he equipped with cannons or not?" "Well, of course, with cannons and with missiles," said Gerasimenko. "Fire a warning burst," Kornikov ordered. "Fire a warning burst with cannons and rock wings to show the direction to Sokol. Bring Tarasov in for the attack as well." "Wilko," said Gerasimenko. "A warning burst from the cannons," Deputat instructed. "Must approach him," said Osipovich. "Turning off lock-on, approaching it." "Give a burst from the cannons," Deputat repeated. Turned off lock-on, giving a burst from the cannons, Osipovich reported. Have you fired the guns, 805? Deputat asked. Yes, sir, said Osipovich. What he did not transmit was that his Su-15 hadn't been loaded with tracer rounds, so firing warning shots would have been useless. There was very little chance that the target would see them. Gerasimenko, Kornikov said. Well, you heard the radio transmissions. Did the pilot fire the warning burst? I cannot hear the radio transmissions, said Gerasimenko. Well, turn to Channel 3 and listen, Kornikov demanded. Tune to Channel 3 there, and listen and stop that horsing around at the command post. Only you, I, and the controller are to talk, no one else. Yes, sir, Gerasimenko acknowledged. Has Osipovich opened fire or not? Kornikov repeated. Was unclear on the recording. Warning burst, said Gerasimenko. He has fired the warning burst? Affirmative, he has. Ask for reaction of target 6065, Kornikov ordered. Over the radio, Osipovich reported, the target has a flashing light. I already approached it to a distance of somewhere like 2 kilometers. Although imprecise, the recorded radar data does not suggest he ever got anywhere near that close. Is the target descending? Deputat asked. The target? No, at 10,000 meters, said Osipovich. Moments later, he asked, 805, my instructions. The target is reducing speed. At that exact moment, the target pitched up and began to climb, causing its speed to fall. Osipovich was caught off guard by the sudden change in airspeed, causing him to lose the attack position. I am already moving out in front of the target, he said. According to radar data, he was never in front of the target, but it is clear that he was no longer in a position to lock on. Increase speed, 805, Deputat ordered. Increased speed, Osipovich reported. Has the target increased speed, yes? Deputat asked. Reducing speed, Osipovich clarified. In the command post, General Kornikov said to Gerasimenko, take control of the MiG-23 from Smirnik. Call sign 163. Call sign 163. He is behind the target at the moment. Destroy the target. Task received. Destroy target 6065 with missile fire. Accept control of the fighter from Smirnik. Gerasimenko read back. Carry out the task. Destroy it, Kornikov repeated. Over the radio, Deputat ordered, 805, open fire on the target. Well, it should have been earlier. Where do I go now? Osipovich replied. I am already abeam the target. Roger. If possible, take up a position for attack, said Deputat. Now I have to fall back from the target, Osipovich explained. With the target off to his side rather than in front of him, it was impossible to lock on and fire the missiles. Your position in relation to the target? Deputat asked. Just now it was at 70 degrees to the left, said Osipovich. Roger, said Deputat. 805, try to destroy the target with cannons. I am already falling back. Now I will try with missiles, Osipovich replied. 163, 12 kilometers to the target, I see both, reported Tarasov, the pilot of the MiG-23 from Smirnik Air Base. At the command post, Gerasimenko reported, Comrade General, he has gone to the attack position. 805, approach target and destroy target, Deputat instructed. Roger, locked on already, Osipovich reported. 805, are you closing on the target? Closing, the target is locked on. Distance to target 8 kilometers, said Osipovich. Oh, how long does it take him to go to attack position? Kornikov complained. He is already getting into neutral waters. Indeed, Sakhalin Island is quite narrow, and the target had nearly reached other side. After that, it would re-enter international waters over the Sea of Japan. Engage afterburner immediately, Kornikov ordered. Bring in the MiG-23 as well. While you are wasting time, it will fly right out. As the Soviet military began its maneuvers, A series of critical events unfolded inside Korean Airlines Flight 007. Now, let's see what happened inside the cockpit and cabin as the crew and passengers experienced these tensions escalating outside. The crew of KAL Flight 007 had no knowledge of the frantic flurry of communications, the barked orders, or the fog of confusion that enveloped the Soviet command posts on Sakhalin Island. In fact, the cockpit voice recording, which began at 1754 UTC, suggested that the flight crew were more bored than alarmed. The first lines on the 30-minute recording were utterly prosaic. "Have you had a long flight recently?" "From time to time." "Sounds good. As far as I know, Chief Pilot Park has a long flight occasionally, but Chief Pilot Lee has." Audio unclear. The sound of a yawn was heard, followed by another. "Having a dull time, please write down a comment now," said First Officer Sun. "Yes." Audio unclear. "Give it to me," said Captain Chun. "If you don't write it, I might not pass the document check," said Sun. The conversation about paperwork continued for some time, until at 18 Qua, a flight attendant entered the cockpit. "Captain, sir, would you like to have a meal?" they asked. "What? Meal? Is it already time to eat?" said Chun. One can almost hear his bleary-eyed confusion. "Do you want to eat now?" someone asked. "Let's eat later," Chun replied. In the background, a passenger announcement played over the public address system. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will be landing at Seoul Kimpo International Airport in about 3 hours. Local time in Seoul right now is 3 a.m. Before landing, we will be serving beverages and breakfast. Thank you." "Why is it still so dark?" Sun casually asked. "It is still a long way to go," said Flight Engineer Kim. "Isn't it time for sunrise yet?" said Sun. The conversation soon returned to paperwork, before KAL Flight 015 called them at 18:03 to have a chat. "What are you doing?" asked the pilot of 015. We have a pleasant chat because Mr. Kim here is giving us a little fun," said Chun. The pilot of Flight 015 chuckled. "Well, after arrival in Seoul, it is better for you to study all those things," he said. "Study what?" said Chun. "There is nothing to be studied. By the way, what a good season. It's autumn. I hope I could take a day off for autumn leaves viewing." Make a schedule, said 015. "Why don't you take some time off and go to Sorak Mountain?" someone suggested. At 18:04, however, the conversation took an interesting turn when KAL 015 asked, "Are you about 3 minutes ahead of us?" "Ah, NOCA estimate is 182.25, over," Flight 007 replied. "Ah, 25, we estimate 1829, said Flight 015. 1 minute late, 1 minute, 4 minutes faster, it's 25, said Flight 007. "It will be very complicated to go through customs. If you want to go faster, go faster. If you want to go slower, go slower. That's the complication." We are now having an unexpected strong tailwind," Flight 015 reported. "How much do you get there? How much in which direction?" Captain Chun asked. 35 knots, said Flight 015. Which direction, which direction?" 040040, Flight 015 replied. The wind was almost directly at their backs, out of the northeast. "Ah, you got so much," said Chun. "We still got headwind. Headwind 215 degrees 15 knots, he said. According to their instruments, the winds at their location were blowing out of the southwest, in completely the opposite direction. If flights 015 and 007 were following the same track, only 4 minutes apart, and with only 2,000 feet of altitude separation, how was it possible that one was experiencing a 35-knot tailwind and the other a 15-knot headwind? The pilot of Flight 015 appeared to recognize that there was an issue. Is it so? But according to flight plan wind direction 360 15 knots approximately, said Flight 015. For a brief moment, Captain Chun hesitated, not knowing that hundreds of lives were at that moment balancing on the tip of his tongue. And then, heartbreakingly, he replied, "Well, it may be like this." How could Chun have failed to recognize that something was deeply wrong? Why didn't the discrepancy set off alarm bells in his mind? We will never know for sure. But one possibility is that he was simply too tired to commit any mental energy to the problem. As the cockpit voice recorder tape continued to tick down the minutes toward disaster, it again captured a chorus of yawns, and then someone asked, "Is he ahead of us?" "Let him go faster," Chun replied. 015 same 29 at Naka as us. Let him go faster. "Why are they in such a hurry?" "They have a tailwind, 35 knots, said Chun. "Oh." Sadly, that was the last anyone spoke of the wind issue. At 1808, Flight 015 suggested that Flight 007 join them at 35,000 feet. The reason for this was not explicitly stated, but it's possible that the crew of Flight 015 wanted to help Flight 007 find the strong tailwind in order to make better time. Flight 007 was by this point already in communication with Tokyo Radio, the Japanese oceanic control facility. Unlike their attempts to contact Anchorage, the crew had no trouble speaking with Tokyo because by this point, the flight was not particularly far away from the nearest radio repeater on the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Some communications also took place via long-range HF radio, which was standard. In order to clear the way for Flight 007, Flight 015 first requested to climb to 37,000 feet and was told to stand by. While waiting, the pilots of Flight 007 casually discussed where to exchange US dollars to South Korean money at Kimpo Airport. Subsequently, at 1814, Tokyo cleared Flight 015 to climb to 37,000 feet. At 1815, KAL 007 requested 35,000. "Stand by, call you back," Tokyo replied. "Oh my God, this radio is very bad," one of the pilots complained. In the background, intermittent sounds of incoming Morse code could be heard, the source of which was never identified. In flight, it's normal to hear Morse code broadcasts. In fact, VOR radio beacons emit Morse code signals containing identification information, which is how pilots verify that they've tuned in to the right VOR. However, it's hard to believe that the pilots of Flight 007 had tuned into a VOR at that moment, since no VORs normally used on Route R20 were then in range. Unfortunately, the quality of the recorded sounds was too poor to decipher the Morse code, so we will probably never know what station they were picking up. For a few minutes, there was silence in the cockpit, other than the occasional Morse code blips and a few unintelligible comments. Then, at 1820, Tokyo Radio transmitted Korean Air 007, clearance. Tokyo ATC clears Korean Air 007 climb and maintain flight level 350. Roger, Korean Air 007, climb and maintain at 350, leaving 330 at this time, Flight 007 replied. Complying with the clearance, Captain Chun selected 35,000 feet in the autopilot window, and the plane began to climb, causing its speed to drop. The pilots of Flight 007 obviously had no idea that at that very moment, Major Osipovich was trailing them in his Su-15, flashing his navigation lights and firing warning shots with his cannon. His standard cannon fire with no tracer rounds would have been invisible in the darkness. Nor is there any evidence that Osipovich's fighter was ever positioned within a direct line of sight from the 747's cockpit. If he was, then evidently the crew of Flight 007 did not see him. Meanwhile, unaware of the impending danger, the crew of KAL 007 continued their routine tasks. But back at the Soviet command post, the urgency was escalating. "Afterburner," Deputat ordered. "Afterburner, 805. "Already switched on," said Osipovich. "So, 23 is going behind. His radar sights are engaged. Draw yours off to the right immediately after the attack. Has he fired or not? Kornikov asked. Not yet, not at all, said Gerasimenko. Why? He is closing in, going on the attack. 163 is coming in, observing both, Gerasimenko reported. Okay, Roger, understood. So bring 163 in behind Osipovich to guarantee destruction, said Kornikov. Yes, said Gerasimenko. Well, what is happening there? Kornikov asked. Afterburner has been ordered. He is closing in, Gerasimenko reported. Well, how long can it take to close in from a range of 5 kilometers? I do not understand, Kornikov exclaimed. At that exact moment, Osipovich made his move. With a roar, he let loose an R-98 heat-seeking air-to-air missile, followed moments later by a second R-98 with radar guidance. Launch, he reported. Executed launch. For a moment, the command post fell silent. Then, far above the coast of Sakhalin Island, an explosion shattered the pre-dawn darkness, billowing into the night. The deed was done, and there would be no turning back. The time was 18:26 and 1 second. In the cockpit of his Su-15, Major Gennady Osipovich keyed his microphone and dryly reported, "The target is destroyed." At 18:26 and 2 seconds, precisely as Osipovich was uttering the words, "Target is destroyed," the cockpit voice recorder capturing the sound of a massive explosion as the heat-seeking R-98 missile exploded in the vicinity of the 747's vertical stabilizer. The radar-guided missile appeared to miss. The explosion immediately inflicted severe damage to the flight controls, hydraulic systems, and aircraft structure. In the cockpit, the rudder pedals immediately slammed to their maximum deflection due to the failure of a rudder control cable, but the rudder itself remained in the neutral position. Analyzing black box data, investigators would later determine that the blast also opened a hole in the pressure cabin, measuring approximately 0.16 meters square, 1.75 square feet, resulting in a rapid decompression. A cacophonous wind would have filled the airplane, followed by the automatic deployment of the oxygen masks. The first reaction of the pilots was one of shock. "What's happened?" somebody shouted. "What?" "Retard throttles." "Engines normal," the flight engineer called out. The pilot's first instinct upon feeling the explosion would have been to check for signs of an uncontained engine failure, but all 4 engines were operating normally. The explosion also damaged the 747's elevators, which control the aircraft's pitch. The 747 has 4 separate elevators that can move independently if one becomes jammed. Additionally, the 747 is designed with 4 independent hydraulic systems to ensure that at least 1 elevator can be actuated, even if 3 hydraulic systems fail, making the design highly failure-resistant. However, the widespread damage from the blast is believed to have disabled hydraulic systems 1, 2, and 3, leaving only hydraulic system 4 functional. This system controlled the left inboard elevator. This elevator was linked to the right outboard elevator by a crossover cable, allowing both control surfaces to move together as long as one still had hydraulic power. Unfortunately, the explosion likely severed this crossover cable, causing the right outboard elevator to become free-floating. Almost immediately, this rogue elevator jammed in the maximum nose-up position, sending the plane into an uncontrolled climb. The autopilot, which would normally try to pitch the nose down to maintain the selected altitude, could not counteract this. The active autopilot, the 747 has 2, was Autopilot A, which relied on hydraulic system number 3 for its independent hydraulic elevator actuator. With only hydraulic system number 4 operational, only manual control of the elevator was possible. As the plane continued to rise higher and higher, the flight crew frantically sought the source of the trouble as the cabin altitude warning blared in the background. Evidence indicates that the pilots responded properly by donning their oxygen masks. 20 seconds after the missile impact, the autopilot disconnected. Whether this is deliberate is not known. "Altitude is going up," someone shouted. A bell announced that someone in the cabin was trying to get the pilot's attention, but they ignored it. "Speed brake is coming out," someone said, but the flight data recorder logged no change in the speed brake position. The plane was starting to bank uncontrollably to the right. Captain Chun attempted to pitch down, but with only one of the plane's 4 elevators operational and with one of the others pinned at maximum nose up, incredible force would have been required to generate a response. In fact, calculations would later suggest that the airplane's response to his inputs was only half of what would be expected even under this dire scenario, suggesting that there was likely structural damage to their remaining elevator as well. "I am not able to drop altitude now, unable," he shouted. "Altitude is going up." "This is not working, this is not working," somebody said. The FDR recorded a reduction in engine power, presumably to help bring the nose down, but this too was ineffective. "Manually! Cannot do manually." In the background, an automated passenger announcement began, its calm, detached voice slicing through the chaos. "Attention, emergency descent," it said, first in Korean, then English, then Japanese. "Put out your cigarette. This is an emergency descent." Another autopilot disconnect warning sounded. "Not working manually also," someone exclaimed. "Engines are normal, sir," Flight Engineer Kim reported. "Is it power compression?" someone asked. "Is that right? Put out your cigarette. This is an emergency descent. Put the mask over your nose and mouth and adjust the headband." At that moment, their altitude peaked at 38,250 feet, and then the plane began to descend, banking 23 degrees to the left. The pilots attempted to level the wings, but with only one working hydraulic system, the only roll control available was the right inboard aileron and 2 of the roll spoilers. The yaw damper, which stabilizes the aircraft in yaw, was also inoperative. Unable to stop the roll with the severely degraded flight controls, the bank angle increased to 52 degrees as the plane nosed over into a rapid left-hand spiral descent. Keying his microphone, First Officer Sun managed to broadcast a desperate call to air traffic control. "Tokyo Radio, Korean Air 007, he shouted through his oxygen mask, struggling to be heard above the incredible noise in the depressurized cockpit. "Korean Air 007 Tokyo, the controller replied. "Roger, Korean Air 007, voice unclear. We are experiencing rapid compressions. Descend to 10,000. The message was garbled and faint, difficult to make out amid the background noise. "Korean Air 007, unreadable, unreadable," said the controller. "Radio check on 10048. "Attention, emergency descent," droned the automatic PA. "Put out your cigarette. This is an emergency descent. Put the mask over your nose and mouth and adjust." At time 18:27 and 46 seconds, 104 seconds after the explosion, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder simultaneously went dead. Damage to the electrical system may have been the cause, but in the end, the exact reason for the failure of the black boxes is not known and will probably never be known. From then on, KAL 007's fate is murky, even as the crew no doubt fought desperately to save her, waging a futile battle against their own dying aircraft. But in the dark, with almost no flight controls and untold structural damage, there was very little they could do to stop their once mighty 747 from embarking on a slow, agonizing spiral down toward the distant sea. As Flight 007 began its lengthy death spiral, Major Osipovich was called off the pursuit, sent back to base with his fuel tanks running low. Simultaneously, General Kornikov ordered the MiG-23, 163, to verify the kill. Kornikov was clearly nervous. The target was still visible on radar, and he seemed unsure whether Osipovich had actually dealt a fatal blow. In fact, Tarasov, the pilot of 163, could still see the 747, descending through 9,000 meters in a steepening left turn, although he erroneously reported that it was turning to the right. "Has Osipovich reported the result of his fire or not?" Kornikov asked. "Comrade General, the target is in a right turn," Gerasimenko reported. "Well, I understand. I do not understand the result. Why is the target flying? Missiles were fired. Why is the target flying? What is happening?" Over the next several minutes, further attempts were made to clarify the situation without much success. By 1832, Fighter 163 had lost visual contact with the target in the area north of Monoron Island, just west of Sakhalin in the Sea of Japan. The target's spiraling track brought it repeatedly in and out of Soviet waters, leading to further confusion. The tapes even captured two officers discussing whether the target was in Soviet airspace at all when the missiles were fired. They concluded that it was. On radar, the target was still visible, descending rapidly through an altitude of 5,000 meters. Background statements suggested that the target should be finished off. However, at 1835, the target disappeared from radar northeast of Monoron Island, and after that, no one laid eyes on it again. On the Sea of Japan, in international waters west of Sakhalin, the crew of a Japanese fishing boat heard the sound of a low-flying airplane, followed by a loud boom and a flash on the horizon. A dull roar and another flash followed seconds later, emanating from the southeast. The scent of jet fuel washed over them, then faded away. Thus, in the Sea of Japan, Korean Airlines Flight 007 and her 269 souls rest in eternal slumber, cradled by the Sea Mother's embrace, never to awaken again, unaware of the dramatic incidents that occurred around them. And that concludes the heartbreaking story of KAL 007. We hope you found it informative. Stay tuned for more videos. Until next time, take care and goodbye.